Everyone. Okay, so today we are going to see how the US finally defeats Japan. So remember that we had Victory in Europe Day. Germany had surrendered, Hitler is gone. And now we're going to talk about the war on the South and Southeast Asia, and we're going to talk about our victory with Japan. So here we go. Okay, so wherever you see blue, you're going to put the word. So we have the American counterattack and victory over Japan, 1942 to 1945. With the victory at Midway, American forces rallied and began to stop the Japanese victories. Soon, incredible American economic resources produced an unprecedented war machine that brought Japan to its knees by 1945. So here is the Japanese Empire in 1942. The turning point, following victory at Midway, the US won almost every battle and gained a decisive edge in weapons and supplies. And here are the Japanese plans. So they wanted to take over Alaska, Hawaii, India, Despite the defeat at Midway, Japan still planned to seize the Solomon and Samoan Islands, thereby cutting off the US supply line to Australia. Meanwhile, the Japanese army would push from Burma toward British-controlled India. The US and the Allies also had plans. Take back the areas that were taken over. By 1943, a massive US military buildup would lead to broad offensives in the Marshall and Solomon Islands. Japan's first step toward expansion to Samoa was control of the Solomon Islands. US forces rushed to cut off this expansion and control Guadalcanal. Securing the South Pacific, US forces win a key battle at Guadalcanal, where air, land, and sea battles raged simultaneously. Guadalcanal campaign. So there hold lessons after that. Secret codes. The Axis and the Allied powers both use secret codes that transmit important military information. The Germans used a code machine called Enigma that they thought was unbreakable. but British mathematicians broke the Enigma code with the world's first computer, and this helped to shorten the war. We had also talked about this before, but there were code talkers. Americans also tried to develop an unbreakable code. They turned to a group of Native Americans called the Navajo. The Navajo soldiers used their language to communicate and send secret messages. Only about 30 people knew the language. It did not have a written alphabet. Code talkers could send messages much quicker than code machines could. Japan's best strategist, Admiral Yamamoto, was ambushed in the air and killed in April of 1943. He was one of the bombers that got him. A new strategy. U.S. General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz began island hopping, invade important islands, and bypass the heavily defended or unimportant islands. Island hopping referred to winning and taking over one island at a time until they reached the mainland of Japan. Each captured island became a stepping stone that brought the U.S. closer to Japan. U.S. forces swept across the Pacific, seized the Solomon, Gilbert, and Marianas Islands by the summer of 1944. Destruction of Japan's Imperial Navy. The Japanese fleet was crushed by U.S. forces at the Battle of Philippine Sea in June of 1944. By the summer of 44, American forces prepared to land troops in the Marianas with a focus on Saipan and Guam. Japanese naval forces prepared to intercept. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest modern naval battle in history. Japan's first step toward expansion to Samoa was control of the Solomon Islands. U.S. forces rushed to cut off this expansion and control Guadalcanal. So here, the Pacific War after Leyte Gulf. As American submarines increasingly sunk Japanese ships and resupply vessels, here, ship meets torpedo. The United States submarine force of roughly 200 boats destroyed 1,300 Japanese merchant ships and 200 warships. The Mark 14 torpedo was the main weapon. Japan began the use of kamikaze suicide attacks. 2,800 kamikaze attackers sank 34 Navy ships, damaged 368 others, killed 4,900 sailors, and wounded over 4,800. Sea mine warfare versus Japan. Not a single Essex-class aircraft carrier was sunk during the war. To the Philippines. General MacArthur returned as U.S. forces liberated the Philippines in March of 1945. Closing in. U.S. forces seized Iwo Jima and Okinawa despite ferocious Japanese resistance. In there. The Battle of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was a tiny volcanic island, only 8 square miles in size. It is only 660 miles southeast of Tokyo and was an essential airbase for bombing missions over Japan. On February 19, 1945, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions landed on Iwo Jima. The Japanese soldiers, burrowed into hiding places, were invisible to the American Marines landing on the island. At first, the Marines met almost no resistance. It was not until they had made their way well inside the nest of hidden enemy that the Japanese opened fire from caves and disguised pillboxes. The barrage of deadly fire cut Marines in half. Surviving Marines scrambled to take cover, but found it impossible to dig into the island's volcanic ash. To break the impasse, flamethrowers were brought in to burn out the unseen enemy. The bloody battle for this small volcanic island was very costly. More than 6,000 Americans were killed and another 18,000 wounded. By the middle of March 1945, American bombers were taking off from Iwo Jima's airfields and flying bombing missions against Japan. So Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal snapped this famous picture of 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman raising the American flag at the top of Mount Suribachi. Before the island was taken, 3 of the flag raisers would die. And then Pacific War after Iwo Jima. The Battle of Okinawa. By the spring of 1945, intense and fierce fighting continued. It appeared that the Allies would have to invade Japan. An invasion was planned for November of 1945. The Allies would need a staging area for the invasion, a place to build up the troops and supplies that would be needed. The island of Okinawa, only 350 miles from Japan, fit the requirements of military planners. While American Marines and soldiers faced the fury of the unseen enemy on the island, naval vessels offshore faced the devastating attacks of Japanese kamikaze or suicide pilots. Over 7,600 American troops died in the battle. The Japanese losses were much greater. 110,000 died, including 2 generals who committed ritual suicide rather than surrender. Almost 80,000 Okinawan civilians died. Although the battle for Okinawa was over, the war continued. There was still no indication that the military government of Japan would surrender. Policymakers in the United States had a decision to make. If the battle for Okinawa was an indication of how ferociously the Japanese would fight, the cost of invading Japan would produce staggering casualties for our fighting men and Japanese civilians. Then, as planners weighed the possibilities, news arrived from Alamogordo, New Mexico in July. The world's first atom bomb had been successfully detonated. A new option was available that would allow us to avoid the bloodbath that would surely ensue if we invaded Japan. The grueling punishment and devastating losses experienced on Okinawa would help to sway that decision. Japan's most powerful battleship, the Yamato, was finally sunk in April of 1945. Yamato was hit by no less than 6 bombs and 11 torpedoes. Virtually the entire crew was lost as the Yamato exploded and sank. Here's a comparison over the years of how many US versus Japanese naval fleets. By the end of August of 1945, the US had 803 versus 49 for Japan. We're getting closer to Japan. The Manhattan